The woods had a way of swallowing sound. Even the wind moved carefully there, as if afraid of what it might wake. Tall trees leaned inward, their branches locking together like fingers conspiring in silence, sealing off the world beyond. Locals said the forest had always been that way, watchful, patient, and unwilling to give back what it took. Few dared to wander too deep, and those who did rarely spoke of what they saw. When they did, their voices trembled, and their stories never stayed the same twice. At the heart of that forest stood a house that did not appear on any map. Weather-beaten and sagging under the weight of decades, it looked less built than grown from the soil itself. Inside, candles burned even during the day, and curtains remained closed no matter how bright the sun. It was there that a wedding took place no one announced, no bells rang, and no records were kept. The bride was 12 years old. The groom was a man she had once called uncle. They told her it was necessary. They told her it was tradition. They told her the woods demanded it. No one asked what she wanted. After the ceremony, strange things began to happen. Livestock refused to enter the tree line. Children claimed they heard crying at night, soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby sung backward. A foul scent drifted from the forest after rain, and symbols appeared carved into bark, fresh and bleeding sap as if the trees themselves had been wounded. When questioned, the family denied everything, their smiles too stiff, their eyes too empty. The girl was rarely seen after that. When she walked with her head lowered, barefoot even in winter, whispering words that didn't sound like English. Some swore she was talking to someone beside her, someone no one else could see. Others claimed the forest was listening, leaning closer every time she spoke. Years later, investigators would try to untangle the truth, but the woods kept their answers buried deep beneath roots and bone. What happened to that child was more than a crime, it was a ritual, a warning, and the beginning of a horror that still breathes quietly among the trees, waiting for the next name to be spoken. The community existed where the road stopped pretending to be maintained, where pavement cracked into dirt and then surrendered entirely to roots and moss. Houses were scattered far apart, as if even neighbors did not fully trust one another, each structure hunched beneath towering trees that blocked out the sky for most of the day. Generations had lived there without leaving, bound not by geography alone but by an unspoken understanding that the outside world was not meant for them. Newcomers were rare, and those who passed through often felt an immediate pressure, a sense of being watched not by people but by the land itself. The woods were older than any family name still spoken aloud. Long before official records were kept, before census takers dared to walk those paths, a single bloodline had taken root there, intertwining itself with the forest until the two were indistinguishable. Locals whispered about them only in fragments, referring to them as if naming them fully might draw unwanted attention. Children were warned not to play near certain clearings, not because of wild animals, but because things happened there that never made it into church sermons or town meetings. Over time, the bloodline faded from public view. Their name disappeared from gravestones, then from deeds, then from memory itself, at least on the surface. But absence did not mean extinction. Old-timers remembered lights glowing deep in the woods long after that family was said to be gone, remembered hearing singing at night that did not belong to any hymn. Some claimed the family had died out through illness or tragedy, others insisted they had simply turned inward, sealing themselves away to protect something precious and dangerous that could not survive scrutiny. What united every version of the story was fear. Fear of what that bloodline had done to survive and fear of what it might still be doing. The community learned early that survival depended on silence. Questions were discouraged, curiosity treated as a kind of sickness. When records went missing or births went unregistered, officials looked the other way. When a child vanished or a scream echoed from the trees, explanations were invented quickly and repeated until they sounded true. The forest itself seemed complicit, reshaping trails overnight, swallowing landmarks, ensuring that anything hidden remained hidden. Even animals behaved strangely near the old family land, circling wide around certain areas as if instinct warned them away. The community told itself that the bloodline was gone, that whatever dark practices once existed had ended with it, yet every generation felt the weight of something unresolved pressing against their lives, a secret passed down not through words but through avoidance, glances, and the shared understanding that some histories were never meant to be uncovered and that the woods were still guarding what remained of that vanished family, and the promise that its story was not finished yet. The decision was made long before the girl was old enough to understand what marriage meant, sealed quietly in conversations she was never allowed to hear. From the moment she could walk, her life followed a path laid out by others, shaped by tradition and fear rather than choice. In that community, childhood was brief and conditional, especially for girls born into certain families. Her 12th birthday did not mark a celebration but a deadline, a moment when whispers turned into plans and plans into action. Adults who had watched her grow suddenly looked at her differently, measuring her not by innocence but by usefulness. They told her the ceremony would protect her. They said it would keep the family safe, keep the forest calm, keep old curses sleeping. The words sounded rehearsed, passed down like instructions rather than explanations. No one spoke of love or companionship. Instead, they spoke of duty, blood, and balance, as if she were a missing piece in a puzzle far older than herself. The man chosen for her was not introduced as a husband but as a necessity, someone who already belonged to her life in a way that blurred every natural boundary. Calling him uncle had once felt harmless, even comforting. Now the word was forbidden. Preparation happened behind closed doors. A dress was sewn without her measurements, rough and heavy, smelling faintly of damp cloth and smoke. She was taught what to say, when to bow her head, when to remain silent. Questions were met with stern looks or gentle hands that pushed her back into place, reminding her that obedience was love and resistance was danger. At night, she cried quietly, afraid the walls themselves might report her doubts to the forest outside. The wedding took place without witnesses who would speak later. There were no official papers, no public vows, only a small circle of faces carved into expressions of solemn relief. Candles flickered as if struggling to stay lit, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The girl stood barefoot on cold ground, feeling as though the earth beneath her was alive, pulsing with expectation. When it was over, nothing felt resolved. Instead, the air grew heavier, as if the act had awakened something rather than appeased it. Afterward, the community behaved as though a problem had been solved. Smiles returned, routines resumed, and silence thickened around the house in the woods. The girl disappeared from daily life, absorbed into a role she had never chosen, her name spoken less and less until she became more symbol than child, a living offering made to preserve a fragile order that depended on her sacrifice and the belief that some lives were meant to be given away before they ever truly began. The truth was not revealed all at once but leaked slowly through cracks in conversation and half-finished warnings. At first, the girl sensed it in the way people avoided certain words, how they replaced names with gestures or silence. The man she was expected to stand beside was familiar, too familiar, and that familiarity began to feel wrong in ways she could not yet explain. When the realization finally settled, it arrived without ceremony, heavy and suffocating, pressing against her chest until breathing felt like an act of defiance. He was not a distant relative, not a stranger chosen by circumstance. He was her mother's brother, a figure who had once lifted her onto his shoulders and laughed with her under the trees. The justification came wrapped in history. Elders spoke of lineage as if it were fragile glass, something that could shatter if handled incorrectly. They claimed the blood had to remain closed, protected from outsiders who would dilute its strength or expose its secrets. In their telling, boundaries that governed the rest of the world did not apply to them. The forest had its own rules, they said, and those rules demanded sacrifices that outsiders could never understand. Love, morality, and law were described as luxuries, not necessities. They spoke of ancestors who had done the same, of unions that looked monstrous to the outside world but had supposedly preserved the family through famine, disease, and violence. Stories were recited like scripture, leaving no room for doubt. Questioning the logic was treated as questioning survival itself. The girl was told that her fear was natural but irrelevant, that fear was simply the body resisting what the blood already knew must be done. Her uncle never argued these explanations. He accepted his role with a calm that felt rehearsed, as though he had been prepared for this moment his entire life. What disturbed her most was not just the act itself but how easily it was accepted. No one flinched when the truth was acknowledged. No one spoke the word incest aloud, yet it lingered in every breath, thick and unspoken. The community reframed it as purity, as duty, as an honor bestowed upon her. They claimed she was special, chosen, strong enough to carry the weight of something ancient. In private moments, she wondered how something so wrong could be spoken of with such reverence. The forest seemed to echo their beliefs. Paths led her back to the same places no matter how she tried to wander. The trees crowded closer around the house, their roots surfacing like veins through soil, as if the land itself approved of what had been done. In that environment, the line between human law and ritual dissolved entirely, leaving her trapped in a world where family was redefined, abuse was disguised as preservation, and her own uncle became both jailer and proof that the bloodline's survival mattered more than her childhood, her future, or her understanding of right and wrong as the woods closed in around them, sealing the truth within their shadows. The rumors began almost immediately, carried on lowered voices and glances that lingered too long before looking away. In a place where everyone knew one another's routines, a sudden change never went unnoticed. People saw the girl no longer walking freely, no longer laughing near the tree line. They noticed the way the man watched her, possessive and alert, and how older relatives positioned themselves like barriers whenever outsiders came near. Nothing explicit was ever said, but suspicion took shape in the shared understanding that something deeply unnatural had been sanctioned. Neighbors whispered in kitchens and on back porches, choosing their words carefully even when no one else was around. Some claimed it was none of their business, that families in the woods had always lived by different rules. Others admitted the truth unsettled them, kept them awake at night, yet still they did nothing. Silence became a form of self-protection. People feared what would happen if they spoke, not only retaliation from the family but from the land itself, which had a reputation for punishing those who interfered. A few tried to rationalize it. They said the girl would be cared for, that the arrangement was legal in ways the outside world wouldn't understand. They clung to the idea that it was a cultural difference, a private matter, anything that allowed them to sleep without guilt. When children asked questions, parents cut them short, teaching them early that curiosity could be dangerous. The lesson was clear: survival meant knowing when to look away. Officials passed through the area from time to time, census workers or inspectors following checklists, but they were met with rehearsed answers and closed doors. Records were vague, names misspelled, ages unclear. No one volunteered information. When asked about the girl, neighbors shrugged or claimed ignorance, each lie stacking upon the last until the truth was buried beneath layers of collective denial. The forest helped, its remoteness providing the perfect shield against scrutiny. Yet the rumors never fully died. They shifted shape, growing darker as fear fed them. Some said the marriage was part of an old ritual, others that the family had always lived outside the law. A few suspected the woods demanded these acts, that the price of peace was paid in human suffering. Still, no one crossed the invisible line that separated concern from action. To intervene would mean acknowledging responsibility, and responsibility carried consequences no one was willing to face. So the community chose silence, each person telling themselves that one voice would not make a difference, that the harm was already done, that involving authorities would only make things worse. In doing so, they became complicit, bound together by a shared secret they pretended not to see. The girl remained trapped not just by her family but by an entire community that heard the whispers, recognized the wrongness, and decided that their own safety mattered more than a child hidden away in the woods, learning that suffering could be ignored as long as it stayed quiet enough. The signs began subtly, almost playfully, as if the forest itself were testing whether anyone was paying attention. Thin lines appeared on tree trunks near the edge of the property, shallow enough to be mistaken for animal scratches, yet too deliberate in their placement to be accidental. At first, no one connected them to the girl. The woods had always been scarred with marks from storms, tools, and time, and people preferred familiar explanations. But the marks multiplied, forming patterns that repeated themselves along narrow paths leading deeper into the trees. Those who noticed felt a vague unease they couldn't quite name. The symbols were crude circles split by jagged lines, spirals that never fully closed, and shapes that looked almost like letters but belonged to no language anyone recognized. They appeared overnight and sometimes vanished just as quickly, covered by fresh bark growth or mud, as if the forest were breathing them in and out. Children claimed they saw the girl walking alone at dawn, her hands stained dark, her eyes unfocused, tracing the symbols again and again as if correcting mistakes only she could see. The family dismissed it as imagination. They said she was restless, adjusting to her new life, prone to wandering like any child raised near the woods. Yet the signs spread beyond their land, creeping toward communal trails and abandoned clearings long avoided. Hunters found them carved into old stumps, fishermen spotted them etched into rocks along the creek. Each discovery carried the same quiet question no one dared ask aloud: why now? Some believed the marks were a message, a warning written in a language shaped by fear and isolation. Others suspected they were a cry for help, the only way the girl could speak without being heard. The idea unsettled the community more than the symbols themselves. If the marks were intentional, then she was not passive. She was aware, watching, reaching outward in ways that threatened to pull others into the truth they were avoiding. At night, lantern light sometimes flickered between the trees, moving too low to belong to an adult, too steady to be chance. In the morning, new symbols appeared nearby, fresher and deeper than before. The forest seemed to respond, branches bending unnaturally, roots breaking through soil where the signs were carved, as if the land were amplifying her message. Animals avoided those areas entirely, leaving behind an unnatural stillness that pressed against anyone who lingered too long. No one confronted her. No one erased the signs completely. They pretended not to see the patterns forming, the path being drawn through the woods like a map made of desperation. The girl continued her silent work, carving her presence into living wood, leaving behind proof that she was still there, still thinking, still resisting in the only way she could, trusting that someday someone would understand what the forest had been trying to say all along. The first death was explained away as an accident, the kind that happened easily in a place where the land was unforgiving and help was far away. A man was found at the edge of the creek, his body twisted among slick stones, neck broken as if he had fallen badly. He had been one of the few who openly questioned the family, who had once muttered that something wasn't right about the girl's disappearance. People told themselves it was coincidence, that suspicion was turning harmless misfortune into something darker than it needed to be. Still, the unease lingered, settling into the community like damp that never quite dried. Then another person went missing. A woman who often walked the forest paths to gather herbs simply never came home. Her basket was found days later near a cluster of trees marked with the same symbols the girl had been carving. Search parties were formed, but they moved cautiously, avoiding certain areas without ever admitting why. The forest seemed to resist them, trails looping back on themselves, sounds echoing from the wrong directions. After a week, the search quietly ended, and the woman's name joined a growing list of those spoken only in the past tense. As months passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. Each death or disappearance followed moments of unrest, rumors surfacing, whispers growing louder. Those who talked too much, who stared too long at the symbols, who mentioned the girl's name in the wrong tone, seemed to be the ones who vanished or met sudden ends. Livestock were found mutilated in ways that made no sense, blood drained or bones arranged carefully beneath trees. The line between human tragedy and something ritualistic began to blur. The family at the center remained untouched. Their house stood unchanged, candles still burning behind closed curtains. They expressed sorrow when required, attended funerals with solemn faces, yet an invisible barrier seemed to surround them. No one accused them directly. Fear had matured into something more calculated, an understanding that asking the wrong question could be fatal. Even law enforcement visits became rare, discouraged by terrain, paperwork issues, and a collective unwillingness to cooperate. Some whispered that the girl was the key, that whatever had been done to her had set something in motion that could not be stopped. Others believed the deaths were offerings, meant to maintain balance, to feed the woods that sheltered them all. At night, screams were sometimes heard far from any house, cut short too quickly to pinpoint. The forest swallowed them whole, leaving behind only silence and the sense that it was watching, waiting. By the time the third body was found, there was no longer any illusion of safety. The community understood, without ever saying it aloud, that something had been unleashed, and that the cost of keeping the secret was being paid in lives, one by one, as the woods tightened their grip and the line between survival and sacrifice disappeared entirely. The journals surfaced by accident, not through investigation but neglect. A roof collapsed in one of the abandoned houses near the edge of the woods, exposing a crawl space that had been sealed for decades. Inside were trunks swollen with moisture, their locks rusted shut, their contents assumed worthless until someone pried one open out of curiosity. What they found was not money or deeds but stacks of notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, pages browned and brittle, ink faded yet disturbingly legible. The handwriting shifted from neat to frantic across the years, as if the writers themselves had been unraveling as they wrote. At first, the entries seemed mundane, detailing weather, harvests, births, and deaths. But patterns emerged quickly. The same surnames repeated, generation after generation, circling back on themselves in ways that made timelines difficult to follow. Dates overlapped where they shouldn't have, and family trees drawn in the margins folded inward instead of branching out. Certain phrases appeared again and again, warnings written as reminders rather than discoveries, suggesting the authors already knew what would happen if the rules were broken. As more pages were read, the truth became harder to deny. The journals described marriages conducted in secrecy, unions between relatives justified as necessary acts of preservation. Writers spoke of keeping the line closed and feeding the woods what it asks for. Children were mentioned not as individuals but as vessels, responsibilities, debts owed to something older and unseen. Several entries described young girls prepared for marriage at the same age as the current child, their fear acknowledged but dismissed as temporary discomfort in service of survival. What chilled readers most was how familiar the language felt. The justifications mirrored the explanations still whispered in the community, word for word in some cases, as if no one had ever questioned them deeply enough to change the script. One journal ended abruptly mid-sentence, the ink smeared as though the writer had been interrupted. Another included drawings of the same symbols now appearing throughout the forest, identical in shape and placement, suggesting the practice had never stopped, only paused. There were mentions of consequences for disobedience. Entries spoke of people who had tried to leave, to expose the truth, or to marry outsiders. Their ends were recorded without emotion, listed as necessary losses. The forest was described almost as a living authority, reacting violently when angered and generously when appeased. Over time, the writers began to sound less like victims and more like caretakers of a system they no longer questioned. When word spread that the journals existed, panic followed. Some demanded they be destroyed, fearing what might happen if the past was fully unearthed. Others felt a grim validation, proof that what was happening now was not an isolated horror but part of a cycle deliberately maintained. The discovery stripped away the last excuse of ignorance, revealing that the community had inherited not just land and silence, but a blueprint for cruelty that had been followed faithfully for generations, waiting patiently for the next child to be chosen and the next secret to be buried beneath ink, wood, and earth. The forest seemed to shift in ways that no one could fully explain. Trails that had been walked for years suddenly ended in thick tangles of undergrowth, and familiar landmarks disappeared overnight. Hunters swore they had seen the same tree in two places at once, or that paths looped back impossibly, bringing them to clearings they thought were miles away from their starting point. The land itself appeared to be alive, moving subtly but decisively, as if it were responding to some unseen force, protecting its secrets and punishing curiosity. Animals reacted first. Deer and foxes avoided certain sections entirely, refusing to cross invisible boundaries marked by an instinct no human could comprehend. Birds that once nested in the tallest pines vanished, their songs silenced, leaving only an eerie quiet that pressed down like a weight. Even domesticated animals exhibited odd behaviors. Dogs howled at empty spaces, horses refused to enter shaded paths, and cats disappeared for hours only to return limping and silent. It was as if the forest had developed a sentience, aware of who belonged and who did not. The human inhabitants felt it too. Children grew wary of certain clearings, their games curtailed by a dread they could not articulate. Adults avoided walking alone after dusk, citing nothing tangible but a pervasive sense of being watched. Some claimed that they heard whispers carried on the wind, voices neither male nor female, calling names that had not been spoken aloud for decades. Those who dismissed the stories found themselves disoriented, lost on paths they had walked countless times before, emerging exhausted and shaken in places they did not recognize. The girl's influence seemed to intertwine with the forest's unnatural behavior. Wherever she went, the woods followed, bending and twisting to accommodate her movements, hiding her presence or exposing it as needed. Marks she left on trees or rocks were absorbed and transformed by the environment, becoming part of the landscape in ways that were both subtle and unnerving. It was as though the forest amplified her will, translating her fears and desires into the language of nature itself, speaking to those who dared to notice. Outsiders who entered the woods were seldom the same upon leaving. Some returned with wild eyes and fragmented stories, speaking of impossible loops, sudden darkness, and shadows that seemed to pursue them. Others never returned at all, swallowed by the terrain that refused to release them. The villagers did not intervene, understanding instinctively that the forest's power was intertwined with the family and that interference could awaken consequences far greater than the disappearance of a single person. With each passing season, the forest grew bolder. Trees pressed closer to homes, roots surged through cellars, and the air itself carried an oppressive sense of surveillance. It was alive, patient, and unforgiving, a force that did not merely protect its secrets but actively participated in them, ensuring that the horrors contained within its depths remained hidden, controlled, and unstoppable, as if it were waiting for the next wrong step, the next scream, the next act of defiance to be claimed entirely by its shadowed expanse. The outsider arrived in the village like a gust of wind, unnoticed at first, carrying questions that no one else dared to ask. He was a man with no ties to the woods, no family buried in the soil, and no memory of the whispered rules that governed life there. At first, the locals tolerated him, thinking his curiosity harmless, imagining he would leave once he realized the remoteness of the place. But he lingered, walking the paths that had been avoided for decades, peering into windows, asking questions about families long thought extinct, and noticing the faint carvings on the trees that had gone unremarked for years. His presence disrupted the careful silence that had shielded the community. People began speaking to each other in hurried whispers, their eyes darting toward the woods as if seeking protection from some unseen danger. The girl's family grew increasingly vigilant, locking doors, posting watchful glances, and correcting stories for anyone who might overhear. They understood instinctively that this man had the potential to unravel everything, to expose the truth they had spent generations hiding. The forest seemed to respond as well, branches swaying in unnatural patterns, wind carrying unfamiliar sounds, creating an invisible labyrinth to confuse and deter him. Despite warnings that were vague but heavy with menace, the outsider pressed on, documenting details in notebooks, photographing symbols, and piecing together fragmented stories from reluctant neighbors. Each step into the heart of the woods brought him closer to the house where the girl lived, and with each step, the atmosphere thickened. Birds fell silent, animals vanished, and a tension gripped the very air around him, as if the forest itself were testing his resolve. Locals whispered that he could see things others could not, that he was walking a line between curiosity and danger that no one had survived before. One evening, he set up camp near the house, determined to witness what had been hidden for so long. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, shifting with intent rather than the angle of the moon. From the tree line, faint movements could be glimpsed, the girl walking barefoot, symbols freshly carved into bark, her eyes wide and unblinking. The outsider tried to approach, notebook in hand, but the forest seemed to close in on him. Trails twisted and doubled back, branches snagged at his clothes, roots tripped him, and whispers grew louder, echoing names he could not recognize. Every instinct screamed to leave, but he pressed on, compelled by the need to know, to expose, to survive long enough to tell the truth. By morning, there was no trace of him where he had camped. His notes were scattered, pages damp and illegible, and the locals pretended not to notice his absence. Some whispered that the forest had claimed him as it had others before, feeding on his curiosity and leaving only the memory of his determination as a warning. The girl remained, moving silently through the woods, her presence intertwined with the land, and the secret endured, protected not just by people, but by something older, something patient, and utterly unforgiving, ensuring that those who sought the truth would never leave with it intact. Even after years passed, there were signs that the forest's grasp and the family's influence had not loosened. Those who lived near the old house spoke in hushed tones about shadows that moved against the wind, shapes glimpsed between the trees, and footsteps that echoed when no one should have been walking. The girl, now older but still strangely small for her age, remained at the center of it all, her presence both a mystery and a warning. Locals claimed she had learned to speak to the forest, whispering in a language no outsider could understand, leaving symbols and signs that carried meaning only to those attuned to the wood's dark rhythms. Stories continued to circulate of people venturing too close, drawn by curiosity or a sense of obligation to uncover the truth, and never returning. Hunters, hikers, and occasional reporters vanished silently, leaving behind nothing but broken trails, overturned rocks, and faint, lingering scents that suggested they had been there. The forest seemed to feed on attention, warping itself to prevent intrusion, reshaping paths, hiding landmarks, and erasing tracks. Those who survived encounters described disorientation so complete it was as though the land itself had rewritten its map, erasing all attempts to track or follow logic. The family had adapted as well. They moved through the woods with a quiet confidence, their footsteps known only to the forest. They rarely appeared in public, but when they did, there was a strange stillness in the air, a sense that time itself hesitated. Rumors of rituals persisted, whispered from generation to generation, each retelling adding layers to the original horror, confirming that the practices were not isolated, but a deliberate and continuous effort to preserve a lineage and a power that was older than the community itself. The girl's story became intertwined with the legacy of the forest. She was no longer merely a child, she was a symbol, a living reminder that the line between victim and instrument had blurred completely. Her presence suggested that the horrors of the past were not only preserved but perpetuated, encoded into the land itself. Anyone who stumbled into the woods, intentionally or by accident, encountered a system far larger than themselves, a network of fear, secrecy, and unbroken tradition that moved with silent precision. Even those aware of the danger found themselves drawn to it, compelled by stories, symbols, or whispers that promised answers. Yet the truth remained inaccessible, contained not by walls or doors but by the wood's patience and cunning. The legacy of the bloodline endured, intertwined with the land in ways impossible to separate. Each disappearance, each sign, each unnatural event was proof that the story was unfinished, that the horror had not concluded, and that the forest, the family, and the girl at its center would continue their quiet, relentless existence, waiting for the next step, the next voice, and the next unwitting intruder to become part of the same dark rhythm that had been alive for generations.